Before we begin, take a deep breath and let the noise of the day slowly fade. Unclench your jaw, soften your eyes, and let the weight of modern life melt away. Tonight, we're not chasing action or drama. We're wandering into the forgotten corridors of boring history, where medieval echoes linger and dark tales unfold like fading ink on parchment. Welcome to Midnight Sleepless, a resting place for tired minds, where the Middle Ages, ancient empires, and strange, dark history stories drift by like soft clouds. Here, knights, castles, and quiet empires return, not with a roar, but with a whisper. Let me know in the comments, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it there? And if you enjoyed these slow, sleepy journeys through medieval times, boring facts, and forgotten worlds, a gentle tap on the subscribe button helps keep this calm storytelling alive. Now, let the story begin. Her hands are red from the cold, but her face is calm. She has done this before. She does not look at a clock or a calendar. She knows the right time by the feel of the air, by how quickly her breath vanishes, by the weight of the snow upon the roof. Children gather near the hearth once more, chewing slowly on hard-aged cheese. It is tangy and crumbles between their teeth like chalk. Their mother breaks a thick barley cake and offers it in halves. The bread is dense, with little rise, but flavored with remnants of last summer's herbs. Dipped in broth, it softens. They eat with both hands, cupped, keeping the warmth close in another part of the longhouse. An elder stirs a pot of fermented milk. The contents bubble softly, alive with the quiet pulse of transformation. It smells sour and sharp, but not unpleasant. This is skyr, a kind of curd, cultured with a sliver of the previous batch. It will be strained later with linen and stored in small ceramic jars, sealed with tallow. No part of it will be wasted. Nearby sits a wooden vat lined with ash. Inside are several fish, gutted and cured, wrapped in brined birch bark. Their eyes have clouded, their skin stiffened with salt. They will be buried in the snowbank just outside of nature's own cold cellar. When needed, they will be thawed slowly near the fire, their flavor intensified but safe, preserved with nothing but knowledge and patience. The preservation of food was not limited to meat and fish. Berries, too, had their place. Crowberries and lingonberries were boiled into thick pastes and poured into wide, shallow dishes to dry. Once firm, the sheets were folded and stored in leather pouches. They were sour, deeply so, but filled with nutrients in memory of sunlight. Sometimes these were mixed with fat to make a kind of energy cake, something warriors could carry for long journeys. At the back of the longhouse sits a stack of birch boxes, sealed with wax and lidded with carved wood. Inside, you'd find flat bread, stacked like stones each, round, baked hard, and dry to last the season. Some had seeds pressed into them, others were plain. They softened when steamed, but mostly they cracked and crumbled in the mouth. Yet they filled the belly, and that was enough. Each of these methods, smoking, salting, drying, fermenting, required no haste, no fire beyond warmth. They aligned with the natural world, not against it. They respected decay without surrendering to it. Food was not fought for. It was guided into stillness, into sleep, into preservation. And so, the Vikings made their winter meals from quiet things. There was no feast, there was no extravagance, but there was always enough. A thin strip of dried lamb, soaked overnight and added to broth, could flavor a pot for 6. A spoonful of preserved berries could lift a bowl of porridge into something memorable. Thin curl of smoked fish could sustain a farmer through hours of snow chopping and roof dash mending. All of this was stored not in abundance, but in balance. The hearth never boasted. It only held what had been earned and kept. Now, as the light begins to fade from even the cloudy sky, the family gathers again. Someone opens a leather pouch and offers small bits of jerky. Okay? Another pours warm water over dried herbs, making a kind of tea that smells of mint and pine. The children sit with knees tucked under cloaks, their hands warming against the wooden cups. There is no hunger here tonight. Only the quiet satisfaction of planning well, of preserving carefully, of tasting memories, and as the fire crackles, and the smoke curls upward into the beams where meat still hang and sway gently with the shifting air. There's a calm understanding shared between generations. The art of keeping is just as noble as the art of creating. And now, as the last ember sighs beneath its ash blanket, the scent of smoke mingles with the softness of wool and winter air. The stories of this night begin to settle. Each tale woven from thread and ash, salted memory and spinning light has drifted softly into the quiet space beside you. No sharp corners, no loud goodbyes. Only the rhythm of lives once lived gently, kept alive through stillness. Perhaps you find yourself imagining the longhouse, now completely still, everyone asleep. Food preserved, fire hushed. Or perhaps you simply let the images blur, letting one drift into another like falling snow, one quiet moment sliding into the next. That is enough. Thank you for allowing yourself this rest, for walking slowly, softly through the woven paths of the past. If you feel at peace here, you're gently invited to subscribe, so these slow journeys may find you again. And if your eyes are still open, you're welcome to share in the comments when and where you're listening tonight. But only if you feel called. For now, may your breath be steady, your sleep be deep, and your dreams be as soft and quiet as winter wool spun by Firelight. Good night. At the heart of Constantinople, where the sun poured through vast domes and painted walls in gold and blue, the great Hagia Sophia stood, not just a place of worship, but a city within the city. Beneath its soaring vaults and in the long, echoing side halls, silence was not absence. It was present, ancient, layered, and soft as ash settling on stone, among the mosaic angels and drifting incense smoke. One monk kept a quiet rhythm known only to himself. He was not a priest or theologian. He held no title. He did not sing at liturgy nor led processions. Instead, he swept, slowly, silently, patiently, a corner here, a stair there, the shaded alcove near the candle shelf. His robe was the color of soot, patched at the elbows. His sandals were thin from wear, but soundless. Most people didn't know his name. They called him the one who counted dust each morning. Long before the outer doors were opened, he entered through a small servant's passage. The smell greeted him first, the mingled traces of beeswax, cool stone, and old incense clinging faintly to every pillar. He breathed it in like bread before a fast. He carried no tools but a broom made of twigs bound with old cord and a linen cloth tucked into his belt. He began his work near the eastern apse, where the floor was uneven and carried the footprints of centuries. There, beneath the mosaic of the Virgin and Child, he paused, not to pray, but to feel. His hand brushed the marble wall. It was cool, faintly textured. Here, dust collected first, stillness beneath stillness. He swept in circles, not tight, fast motions, but wide, slow arcs, moving the dust into soft spirals before guiding it toward the edges of the nave. He did not speak. He listened to the creak of old beams, the distant tap of pigeons nesting in the upper gallery, the sigh of cloth as banners shifted in the faintest breeze. The building breathed, and he moved with it. He had once tried to keep count, not of hours or days, but of changes. A crack that widened minutely along the base of a column. A chip in the marble railing where a candle once fell. The wear in the tiles shaped like a crescent moon. A place where thousands had turned, year after year, toward the altar. His mind held these things, not as a record, but as a way of seeing, a slow witnessing of time. Later, in the morning, the city would stir priests chanting in the upper choir, visitors pacing the mosaic floors, footsteps echoing like distant birds. Go. Before that, there was only him and the dust. He once said to a novice, quietly, in passing, dust is not the end of things. It's what they remember when they've forgotten what they were. The novice had not understood, but had nodded respectfully. He often paused to inspect the candle shelves. The drips of wax told him how long each flame had burned. Thin streaks meant brief prayers. Pools meant someone had stayed. These marks, to him, were as readable as books in the southern gallery. He always stopped near the Viking graffiti, shallow runes carved into the stone by a wandering guardsman long ago. He traced them with his thumb as he passed, not to understand the language, but to remember that once someone stood there too, waiting, resting, perhaps thinking of snow. From above, light filtered down in soft beams, catching the airborne dust his broom had stirred. The particles turned gold in the sun, then disappeared again into shadow. He never chased them. He only swept the ones that had chosen to settle. And if you had entered through the high doors before the candles were lit, before the icons were kissed, before the psalms began, and seen this quiet figure move across the ancient stones, would you have thought he was cleaning? Or would you have known he was keeping time? By late morning, the gentle hum of Hagia Sophia began to swell, never loud, but layered. Candles flickered in golden holders. Sandals echoed faintly in the nave. Somewhere in the distance, a chant rose, its notes long and low, melting into the stone like warm water into dry earth. But the monk moved quietly, still beneath this living chorus. His path now took him to the narthex, where pilgrims paused to remove their shoes or trace fingers along the icon's gilded edges. The floor here bore the subtle polish of centuries of feet. The dust was finer, softer, less visible, but no less real. He swept in long, diagonal lines, always guiding the dust toward the base of the walls, where it could gather and to rest. He paused often, not out of fatigue, but attention. At the north vestibule, he watched as a priest adjusted a tapestry, the gold thread fraying at the hem. The monk did not speak, only passed behind him. Noting the gentle brush of wool against air, he touched the railing near the imperial door, where the emperor once stood alone before entering, head bowed. The bronze studs there were worn smooth. A thin thread of spider silk stretched between them, barely visible, catching light only at a certain angle. The monk smiled slightly, then let it be. Not all things needed removing. Some were meant to remind. His cloth now worked quietly across a bench where scholars once sat. He dipped it into a small bowl of scented water, not for cleansing, but for settling the dust. The scent was of bay leaves and fig wood, barely detectable, except when the cloth moved through still air. He wiped slowly, circular strokes, the kind that leave the surface unchanged in appearance, but somehow calmer in presence. From above, the oculus let in a narrow beam of sunlight. It landed near the center of the nave, striking the marble with a pale gold that seemed to hum without sound. Dust motes floated in it, not many, just enough to glisten like sleep in a sunbeam. He watched them rise and fall, blinked slowly, returned to his work. An old nun passed him without words, her hands folded into her sleeves. He stepped aside, bowed slightly. She did the same. Their paths crossed in quiet acknowledgement, two currents in a river of stillness. In the side aisle, where children sometimes whispered to icons in shy reverence, he paused to rearrange a small stool. Someone had moved it, perhaps to kneel, perhaps just to sit and rest. He returned it to its place by the wall, aligning it with the faint groove worn into the floor, shadow of its long habit. The dust he swept was not intrusive. It was not fought. He did not chase it from corners or scrub it from crevices. Instead, he guided it, gave it direction, invited it to settle where it could be at peace. He once told himself, in the silence of early dawn, stone remembers in dust, and dust remembers in silence. He knew where the drafts gathered, near the upper stair, where two arches met. A breeze always moved when the outer door was open. He would wait for it, each day, just long enough to let it stir the air, then sweep afterward, reclaiming the dust that had tried to dance. He stopped beside an old column with a slight tilt, barely noticeable. A crack hair-thin ran down its base. He touched it with one finger. The stone was dry and cool. He did not measure it. He did not mark it, but he remembered. Each morning he checked the line. Each evening he remembered its shape. The chant had faded. Footsteps passed more frequently now. The hush of reverence had begun to shift toward the rustle of midday. Still, the monk continued. Behind a pillar, he folded a cloth around a small piece of wax fallen from a votive offering. He placed it in a pouch, tied to his belt, not to discard it, but to return it later to the candlestand, to be melted again. Nothing was wasted in this place, not even light. At the final archway before the sanctuary, he paused and let the light fall across his feet. The floor there, worn into a shallow groove, caught the shadow of a swinging incense chain. He did not sweep the space. It was always clean. The motion of robes, of passing pilgrims, of wind through robes and turning bodies, it did the work. For him, some places, he had learned, cleansed themselves through being seen, and if you had walked behind him, watched his fingers brush gently along the wall. His broom whispered across the marble. His cloth curled dust into quiet folds. Would you have seen a cleaner? Or would you have recognized a kind of keeper? One who did not tidy the sacred, but simply moved with it in time. As the sun reached its afternoon arc, high above the domes of Constantinople, the light within Hagia Sophia shifted once again. It no longer poured, but lingered, stretched thin across mosaics and marble, tracing golden edges on worn stone as if brushing a sleeping face. The sounds softened. Fewer feet, quieter prayers, the rustle of cloaks gathering near doors. The sanctuary did not empty, but it began to rest. The monk folded his cloth and placed it inside a small wooden box near the candle shelf. His broom leaned against the wall beside it, still warm in the handle where his palm had rested. That he poured what remained of the scented water into the basin tucked behind the pillar, not wasting it, but returning it. The scent of bay leaf faded gently into the air. He paused near a window ledge in the south gallery. The view from here looked down into the central nave, where shadows danced quietly across the floor. He could see where he had swept, though no one else would notice. The patterns weren't visible to the eye, only to the memory of motion, of where the dust had gathered, of where it had agreed to move. Below him, a priest lit a tall candle, the flame trembling before settling into stillness. The monk watched, then nodded once, not to the man, but to the flame. Near the emperor's gate, he stooped to gather a few fallen wax petals, thin curls of cooling tallow from a candle that had burned low. He wrapped them in a bit of linen and tucked them away. When enough had gathered, he would melt them down again, pour them into new votives. He believed it mattered not to preserve the wax, but to remind it had not been forgotten. He stopped once more by the Viking carving in the stone. His fingers traced the grooves lightly. They had not changed. Neither had his gaze. He stood there for a moment longer, then turned toward the side corridor, where a row of old wooden benches leaned unevenly against the wall. He sat on the farthest one, the one with a crack down the center slat, and removed his sandals. His feet, pale and calloused, pressed softly into the cool stone. This was not a break. It was part of the work. It's the act of stillness after motion, of absorbing the silence he had spent the morning shaping across the nave. The final tour group of the day moved in hushed tones, their guide pointing upward toward the great dome. Speaking in the language of memory and marvel, the monk did not listen. He had heard it all before, and still the building revealed more to him in dust than in words. A breeze passed through the western door, a shift in temperature, a rustle through the hanging banners above the altar. Dust rose faintly in its wake, curling lazily in the beam of late sunlight that cut across the marble like the edge of a quiet thought. He watched it drift, not to judge it, not to catch it, only to witness. He would sweep again tomorrow, and the day after that, not because it was required, but because each day brought a new kind of dust. Each morning revealed where time had settled, and each sweep was not a removal, but a conversation between stone and sky, between silence and breath. When the bell rang from the outer court, a low single note to mark the closing hour, he stood. He adjusted his robe, slid his sandals back on, and passed through the side arch, touching once the place where water once dripped through a fault in the ceiling. It no longer leaked, but the stain remained a memory written in gray. He would exit through the servant's door, as he always did. No one would see him leave, but his work would remain, in the air, in the absence of dust, in the peace that filled the spaces where his broom had passed. And if you had sat there, long after he'd gone, and watched the last of the sunlight fade from gold to gray across the tiles, would you have felt it? Sense that someone had been here, not to clean, not to shine, but simply to listen. High above the rooftops of Constantinople, where the city's breath thinned into open sky, there hung a bell, not one of proclamation or festival, but of vigilance, suspended in a narrow tower along the inner wall. It swayed gently with the wind, its clapper wrapped in thick cloth to prevent unwanted sound. It did not ring. It waited. Beneath it, in a small stone chamber, just wide enough for a mat, a stool, and a low shelf, a man slept. Or tried to. He was not a soldier in the formal sense, though he wore a leather belt with an iron buckle and carried a short blade, mostly to keep away stray dogs or signal runners who came too close at night. His job was to listen, to feel, to keep the bell from ringing unless it was time. The room around him was quiet, thicker in silence than even the chapels below. The wind slipped through narrow slits in the stone, bringing with it scents of soot, sea, and the dry sharpness of mortar. It carried distant traces of bread, baking, oil, smoking, fires, dying. All of it arrived in fragments, like memories too faint to claim, but too familiar to forget. The man called Sentry, though few knew his name, kept a record of dreams on the wall beside him, not written in words, but in notches. Each line marked a night he had fallen asleep without hearing a thing. Most were short, some deeper and longer. There was no punishment for sleep here, only the understanding that rest was part of readiness. His bed was a woven mat over wooden planks, raised slightly to avoid the damp that gathered after long rains. Beside it sat a bowl of water, changed every morning, and a small cloth for wiping sweat from his neck. He slept in shifts, dusk until midnight, then again from dawn until the sun fully rose. In between, he watched. The bell itself, iron-cast and pitted from weather hung just above, suspended from beams blackened with time. It had rung once, long ago, in the year of the great comet, when the harbor fires broke out and the western gate had been breached by mistake. The echo had lasted nearly 3 breaths, then silence. Since then, it had been muffled, its sound preserved like an unopened letter above him. Pigeons nested in the beams, their feathers collecting in corners like gray snow. He did not mind them. Their shifting weight reminded him the bell was still quiet, still waiting at night. The sky above the tower was vast and empty, save for the slow crawl of stars, and once or twice a lantern swinging on a distant wall patrol. He had grown used to the shapes of constellations, not by name, but by mood. Some nights, they clustered close, like family gathered in a small room. Other nights, they spread thin, leaving the sky cold and long. He drank water with fennel steeped in it, not for taste, but to keep the wind from stirring his belly. He rubbed oil into his knees, now aching more each season. He wore a cloth wrap on his head when he slept, to keep the cold from sliding into his ears. These were the quiet tools of his duty, and when he lay down, one arm beneath his head, one knee slightly bent, he did not close his eyes quickly. He listened to the stone cooling, to the breath of the bell above him. The city's heartbeat slowed, but never stopped. If you had climbed the narrow stairs and stood there in the dark, watching him sleep beside the bell, would you have felt the tension of a guard? Or would you have seen something gentler, a man cradled, not by duty, but by silence, holding the city's fears in the rhythm of his rest? The rhythm of the hours in the bell tower did not follow sun or sandglass, but the subtle changes in air and sound. The sentry could feel it through the stone beneath his sleeping mat, a faint change in weight, deepening of the hush that settled over Constantinople as the city surrendered to dusk. The breeze cooled. The distant murmur of footsteps faded. The world narrowed into breath and stillness. He sat now on the low stool beside the bell, rubbing a bit of beeswax into the strap that held the clapper's binding. The wax smelled faintly of old honey and warm smoke. He worked it slowly, with steady fingers, not to tighten the silence, but to preserve it. The bell was never meant to ring without purpose. Its sound, if ever released, would be the voice of something final. Around the edge of the tower, just below the rafters, a shelf of old bricks held his few belongings: a cloth pouch of dried olives, a sliver of goat cheese wrapped in fig leaves, a piece of charcoal used to mark the stone wall with simple lines, not drawings, just a record of days, lines grouped in fives, shaded differently depending on the season. Not a calendar, but a rhythm. He had grown to notice the smallest shifts, the way fog rolled in more slowly in spring, the way seagulls turned east in autumn, the scent of cedar wood from the harbor when new ships were being caulked. These changes were his companions. They told him the world was moving, even when no feet passed beneath his tower. Below him, in the city's veins, the siege crept on, not loudly, but with quiet consequence. Fewer carts rumbled down the avenues, fewer voices carried through the alleys, but there was no panic, just adjustment, a slower pace. People moved as though their steps mattered more. There was no waste, no noise that did not need to be made. At the 6th hour of night, he prepared his rest again. He lay down without ceremony, arms folded across his chest, the heavy wool wrap pulled up to his shoulders. The bell above did not move. The pigeons had tucked their heads beneath their wings, and the sky had turned to ash. Stars faint behind a veil of high clouds. A light rain had started, was barely noticeable, more a hush than a fall, but he heard it in the way the sound curved beneath the arch. It dotted the ledge beside him, pooled briefly in a groove worn by centuries of watching. He blinked slowly. His eyes remained half open, not in vigilance, but in habit. There were no alarms, no rotations to change guard. His was a lonely post, but never a desperate one. He had chosen it for its quiet, for the way the city sounded from above, when all it asked for was patience in the stillest moments. He would sometimes speak, not aloud, but inwardly repeating the same phrase. If the bell does not ring, the city still dreams. It was something he had told himself on the first night, when the job was new and the silence unnerving. Now, it was simply part of the air at the far end of the tower chamber. A lantern burned low, not for light, but to keep the damp from settling in too deep. It threw a soft circle of amber on the wall. He watched it flicker as he drifted between waking and sleep. The bell never stirred. It did not threaten, nor promise. It simply was, and so he slept, not deeply, but well enough, with one hand near the wall, with his ear toward the door, with the silence of the city folded gently across his chest like a second blanket. If you had sat beside him in that high stone room, the rain whispering on the sill and the weight of the bell above, would you have felt fear? Or would you have sensed something quieter, a kind of peace built not from safety, but from steadiness? Morning came, not with noise, but with pale light bleeding gently across the sky, a soft silver behind the veil of lifting rain. In the bell tower, the sentry stirred before the sun touched the city's roofs. He rose, without urgency, the stiffness in his joints greeted as an old companion. He folded his blanket carefully, brushed the moisture from the stone ledge with the edge of his sleeve, and leaned once more into the silence that still clung to the room. The bell above him remained unmoved. He took a sip from the clay cup beside his bed, the water cool and faintly metallic from the brass pot he kept sealed in the corner. He chewed a dried olive slowly, pressing the pit into the crack between two bricks where a dozen others had rested before. A ritual, nothing more. Outside, the sounds of Constantinople began to return, not in chorus, but in fragments. Wooden shutter being opened, the distant bleating of a goat, the scrape of a broom over flagstone. These were not alarms. These were proof of breathing. The sentry moved to the archway and looked eastward. Below, the city lay wrapped in morning haze. Rooftops glistening faintly from the light rain, smoke curling from chimneys like thin fingers stretching into the day. The harbor was still invisible, but he knew the masts were there, rocking gently. Even if unmoved, he stretched, lifting his arms overhead, joints cracking like old floorboards. The bell creaked slightly above him, not from wind or warning, but from the pull of age. He placed his hand on its iron curve and held it there for a moment. Not in prayer, not in fear, but in acknowledgement. Beside the bell rope hung a wooden peg with notches, one carved each morning the bell had not rung. It was full now, top to bottom, the line smoothed by the brushing of his sleeve each time he passed. He would carve a new peg soon, not to mark the days of safety, but to honor the quiet. He returned to the corner, unwrapped a small cloth bundle, and removed a slip of parchment. On it, the steward of the quarter had written simply, "Still we wait, still we live." The message had arrived 2 days earlier with a ration drop. He'd read it once, folded it again, and placed it near the wall. He ran a finger over the words. Again now, they had not changed. Nor had he. At the base of the tower stairs, he could hear someone climbing, slowly, carefully, not with urgency. Likely the younger clerk who came weekly to deliver oil for the lantern and news from below. The sentry straightened his tunic, set the cloth back in place, and moved to meet him. No one shouted, no one knocked. The quiet was maintained. When the clerk arrived, they exchanged brief nods, a new flask of oil, a few fresh figs, a note, nothing more. The boy asked no questions. He knew better than to disturb the balance of this place after the boy had gone. The sentry sat once more by the doorway, watching the fog lift in threads from the distant dome of Hagia Sophia. The morning bell from a nearby monastery began to toll, low, deliberate, not an alarm, not a call to arms. It's just time, moving forward. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sound pass through him. When it faded, he breathed in deeply, tasting the faint edge of salt and wood smoke. The city had lived another night, and as he reached up to adjust the binding on the bell's clapper, tightening it with practiced hands, you might have wondered, what kind of man sleeps beneath such a burden? But if you listened closely to the rustle of fabric, the sigh of the morning wind, the hush of a bell that did not ring, you might have understood. He was not a sentinel of war. He was a keeper of quiet, And in a city surrounded, it was quiet, not noise that meant life went on, tucked behind the eastern wing of the WWII palace, where the great hall's marble columns gave way to simpler stone. There stood a long, low building with wide windows and no finery at all. It was neither grand nor public, but within its cool, shaded walls, the quiet machinery of cleanliness worked each day without fail. The imperial laundry house. Here, the final weeks before the city's fall tightened like a clasp. The rhythm of folding linens and drying robes did not falter. The air inside held the scent of lye soap, boiled water, and lavender buds steeped in oilcloth. Steam rose in gentle curls from wide copper basins, drifting up to the wooden rafters where old nails held ropes for drying data. The women who worked here were not servants in the way palace scribes used the term. They were caretakers of fabric, of towels used in the sacred bathing chambers, of handkerchiefs touched by emperors, of the finely woven tunics worn beneath ceremonial armor. And now, as uncertainty thickened beyond the gates, they washed each item as if it still mattered at the first bell of morning. The water was heated using olive wood kindling, carefully rationed from the palace stores. Each basin was cleaned the night before, lined with linen to protect the silks. Water from the cistern, cold, iron-touched, filtered through stone, was warmed and mixed with ash soap ground by hand in a side chamber. A worker stirred with a long wooden paddle, the scent rising like warm bread. Nearby, another woman unwrapped bundles sent from the upper quarters. Each package bore a stitched tag, not a name, but a symbol, a bird, a vine, a stylized olive branch. The codes were old and discreet. They told the launderers whose garments these were without ever saying so aloud. Folding cloth was its own language. A towel for the archbishop was folded in thirds, lengthwise first, then edge to center, with the hem facing out. A sleeve from a robe was tucked precisely to avoid creases along the embroidery. Undergarments, even in wartime, were folded with care, laid over stone planks smooth from decades of quiet, repetitive work. Outside, carts rumbled past toward the western walls. The palace windows echoed with the faint footsteps of messengers, in the hushed tones of men who had stopped raising their voices in meetings. Yet inside the laundry, only the sound of cloth being rinsed, wrung, and folded remained. One woman sprinkled lavender water across a cloth napkin, smoothing it flat with the side of her hand. Another stood barefoot on a short stool to reach the highest drying lines, penning tunics with wooden pegs smoothed by use. They did not speak much, these workers, but their silence was not somber. It was focused, practiced, borne in, like the hymns they reinforced. The youngest girl in the room, barely 12, was tasked with folding the small cloths used at the emperor's bedside. She took her time, aligning corners, pressing creases with the warm stone kept in the coals. No one told her to do it slowly. She had simply watched and learned that in this room, care was its own instruction. There were no visible signs of the siege within these walls. No damage, no disarray. The rhythm had changed subtly. The deliveries came later. The bundles were smaller. Some insignias had not appeared in over a week. A folded robe went unclaimed for 5 days before it was placed in a cedar-lined box and stored quietly beneath the bench. The folding did not stop. It continued like breathing, quiet, necessary, invisible to most, but essential. The fabric, once wet, gave off the scent of the city's past, bay leaves, old wood, and the soap made from last year's olives. The cloth whispered as it was turned, its threads relaxing into shape beneath practiced fingers. And if you had stood there, in the doorway where steam met morning light and linen hung like curtains of silence, would you have seen servants? Or would you have seen something deeper, a group of hands folding the last ordinary pieces of an extraordinary world? By midday, the rhythm in the laundry house had settled into its full, silent cadence. The steam had thickened slightly, clinging to the rafters and softening the light that slipped through the high windows. Cloth moved in gentle waves from basin to bench, from peg to fold, passing through hands that did not rush, did not falter. Each movement was deliberate, shaped by years of habit and the quiet conviction that some things must remain steady. Even when the world beyond the walls shifted, the large drying room held garments strung along ropes stretched from beam to beam. The scent was no longer sharp with soap, but softened into something faintly floral, touched with time and the waxed linen used to preserve freshness. Long underrobes, ivory and slate gray, fluttered as the afternoon breeze passed through the open slats of the windows. Near one end of the chamber, two older women inspected a folded cloth for fraying, not to discard it, but to mend it. They worked together without speaking, one holding the seam taut, the other threading a needle of bronze through delicate silk dot at the back of the room. An iron brazier warmed a polished river stone, kept just hot enough to press gentle creases into the emperor's personal hand towels. The woman tasked with this duty had done it for 15 years. Her fingers, though gnarled at the knuckles, were precise and confident. She pressed with care, letting the weight of the stone do the work, not force. Each towel was laid onto a cedar plank, creased twice, and folded into a compact square, never stacked more than 5 high. A young girl moved among the drying lines, carrying a basket of wooden pegs. She stopped to adjust a shifting tunic, smoothing its hem and straightening the sleeves. Though she was still learning, her hands showed early signs of the calm attentiveness shared by the others. She had been taught not to tug or pull at the cloth, only to guide it. The silence in the room was not heavy. It's full of cloth being handled, of water dripping from corners, of breath and effort, and the creaking of old wood under foot. Occasionally, the faint sound of chanting floated in from the palace chapel beyond the courtyard, but it arrived like incense, gently, then gone. In a shaded alcove, a separate set of linens was being prepared, the cloths used for sacred rites. These were handled differently, with cloths over the hands, folded not only for cleanliness, but for reverence. The woman assigned to this task wore a narrow band of wool around her brow, not as uniform, but as memory. Her mother had folded the same cloths in the same place till her hands could no longer grip the corners. The folding had its own liturgy. The cloth was laid face down, the edges turned inward, twice, never once. The corners pinched and aligned by a fingertip, not eye. The final breath, slow, unmeasured, before the linen was placed in its cedar box, lined with laurel leaves and stitched padding. Not one thread could be left exposed. Along the rear wall, bundles awaited return to the upper palace. They were marked now with charcoal ink. Where once embossed wax seals had been used, the ink would wash away in time. The seals had grown scarce. One bundle was left untouched. Its symbol, a sunburst stitched in gold, had not been seen in over a week. The woman who usually collected it had stopped coming. No one asked why. The cloths were laundered as usual, folded with care, and placed beside the others. They would wait. Outside, distant wheels turned along the gravel path. A cart from the western gate, perhaps. But the laundry house did not stir. There was no urgency here, only practice, only purpose. At one corner bench, a woman repaired a frayed hem with a thread pulled from an older cloth. Same dye, same weave. She hummed quietly, more breath than song, and her needle moved in time. Across from her, another worker packed sachets of dried rosemary and fig leaf, pressing them gently between layers of folded towels. They would lend a calm scent to the palace rooms, familiar, reassuring, and if you had stepped quietly into that room, past the steam, past the rhythm of dipping and folding, of mending and pressing, would you have seen laundry, or would you have understood that in this place, cloth was not simply cleaned, it was remembered, restored, and sent back into the world, carrying the shape of care. The light in the laundry house dimmed softly as the sun lowered behind the walls of WWII. Shadows lengthened along the worn stone floor, tapping the benches where fabric had passed all day through quiet, unhurried hands. The air remained warm from the hearths, but the steam had thinned. In its place came the gentle scent of drying linen and the slow hush of closing dot, the day's final bundle. A long, white sleeping robe, trimmed in faded purple, was folded with particular care. It belonged to a member of the Empress's inner household, though no name had ever been spoken. The robe was lined with lamb's wool, worn smooth with use. The woman folding it had done so many times before and knew its weight without needing to lift it. She laid it on the folding bench, brushed its collar flat with the back of her hand, and pressed a single crease along its spine with a stone warmed over the coals in the far corner. The young girl who had tended the drying pegs now sat cross-legged beside a basket of scraps, linen too worn to return, too soft to waste. She carefully rolled each piece into a bundle, tying it with thread. These scraps would be delivered to the infirmary for use as bandages. Though not part of her assigned task, she had taken it upon herself to do it each evening. No one corrected her. The menders finished their stitching, a seam closed, a thread knotted, a tear made whole again. Finished items were returned to the drying line briefly to cool, then folded and stacked in quiet rows on the cedar shelves that lined the rear wall. The shelves bore marks from generations of hands, scratches where basins had been placed, too hard, initials etched where linen had been sorted by the old calendar. Some of the older workers touched these markings before they left each evening, as if anchoring the present to what came before. The final pressing stone was returned to its holder. The coals in the brazier were spread to cool. Bowls were rinsed and dried with scraps, and the floors were swept, not harshly, but as one smooth gesture from corner to corner, guiding the lint and thread ends into small piles to be gathered and burned with lavender stems the next morning. And still the folding continued. A stack of small kerchiefs, most no larger than a man's hand, was gathered near the window. Their edges had been repaired with new thread, their centers rubbed soft with rosemary wash. These were not battle garments, not priestly robes, just the small pieces of fabric people held close, tucked in sleeves, pressed to foreheads, handed from mother to child. They were folded slowly, as one might fold a letter never sent. As dusk deepened, a woman lit the small lamp near the entrance. Its flame glowed amber against the stone wall, reflecting in the polished basin like a second sun beneath the surface. This lamp was not for light, not really. It was tradition. The closing flame. One small fire to carry the day's softness into night. The workers began to gather their things, aprons unpinned, clothes rinsed and laid to dry. Sandals scraped gently as they moved toward the door. One by one, they passed through the archway into the courtyard, their silhouettes slipping across the wall like shadows that had shaped a day. A few exchanged nods. No one spoke. Words were not needed here. The laundry house did not close with a latch or a bell. Quieted, exhaled. Only the young girl remained, placing one last folded robe into a cedar chest lined with lemon leaves. She smoothed it once, then closed the lid with both hands. Her fingers lingered there for a breath, as if tucking the day in to sleep. Then she rose, brushed the lint from her skirt, and stepped out into the soft dark of evening, leaving behind rows of folded cloth, bundles marked in silence, and a stillness that glowed faintly like the lamp left burning near the door. And if you had wandered into that quiet room after they had gone, after the steam had cooled, after the cloth had settled, would you have seen piles of laundry? Or would you have known, by the warmth still held in the creases and the quiet care pressed into every fold, that this was where a city remembered itself, not through power or banners, but through the hands that kept its softest things whole? It began as it often did, with the sound of grinding, not of weapons or armor, but of stone upon grain, the rhythmic, patient churning of flour in the belly of a city bracing for stillness. In the older quarters of Constantinople, near the inner markets and close to the southern slope, where the land dipped gently toward the sea, the Bakers' Guild had already started its work long before sunrise. You find yourself near one such bakery, half hidden behind a colonnade of pale, moss-darkened pillars. The oven here is set low into the ground, ringed with worn bricks, blackened from years of heat. Above it, a vaulted ceiling captures the warm smoke and carries it into a chimney that whispers softly into the sky. Even before dawn, the scent of toasted flour and ember-kissed crust lingers in the air, a quiet signal to those who have waited through the night. The baker himself is not young, nor particularly old. His face is rounded by years of sleep-deprived mornings and the sheen of flour that never quite washes away. His hands are a map of work, knuckles darkened, nails clean but worn, palms dusted in fine white. He does not speak as he works. His words are rare in this place before light. Instead, he communicates through the sound of kneading. The clack of wooden trays, the tap of his finger on dough that has rested just long enough. The flour today is coarse. Supplies have thinned. Once, he could choose among different grains. Fine white from Thrace, nutty brown from Anatolia, millet from the southern provinces. Now, the sacks are fewer, and the dust that rises from them is heavier, drier, almost reluctant. Still, he sifts it with care, blending what remains with water drawn the night before, cooled in a stone basin beneath the floor. The water tastes faintly of iron and linden, the flavor of the underground. Nearby, two apprentices work in slow tandem. One stirs the leaven in a wide ceramic bowl, while the other oils the trays, not with olive oil, which is scarce now, but with the rendered fat of goats preserved in clay pots. They move with quiet focus, their motions practiced, steady. The bakery does not speak, but it listens to the hiss of steam against stone, the crackle of kindling, the soft swell of rising bread. Outside, the air is hushed. The usual street sounds, wheel creaks, merchant calls, haggling voices, have softened to murmurs. News has traveled in tight circles, ships sighted in the straits. Scouts returning with furrowed brows, whispers that the emperor has gathered the remaining officials in the palace's deepest chamber. But here, among the baking stones, time has not hurried. In one corner of the room, a pile of yesterday's loaves rests under linen, not stale, but aging, their crusts thickening, the interiors settling into a soft, chewy calm. These loaves are reserved, not for sale, but for distribution. Later, when the bells chime faintly in the upper city, a small line will gather at the side door. They will speak little. They will receive their share wrapped in coarse cloth, eyes lowered, not in shame, but in quiet routine. The baker's wife moves silently through the room, gathering herbs, thyme, marjoram, a pinch of wild mint. They are ground into salt, which is then brushed lightly across the tops of the morning's batch. She does not ask why this still matters. She knows the flavor is small comfort, but a comfort nonetheless. As the first light spills across the threshold, a boy appears, barefoot and carrying a wax-sealed scroll. He offers it without a word. The baker breaks the seal carefully, his flour-covered fingers brushing gently against the surface. The message is brief, a request for 50 loaves by sundown for the guards on the second wall. He nods once, sets the scroll aside, and continues folding dough with the same soft resolve. This is how cities prepare. Not with shouts or banners, but with fire-tended ovens, hands moving through flour, and the quiet rhythm of those who feed others before feeding themselves. If you were there, standing just inside the archway where the smoke curled toward the ceiling, would you have noticed the shift? Not in fear, but in the way the bread was made slightly smaller. The dough worked slightly longer. The salt spread just a little thinner. By midday, the air in the bakery had thickened with warmth and a gentle scent of baked grain that faintly, sweet, nutty aroma that settles in the corners of a room and clings softly to cloth and skin. The hearth still glowed, not fiercely, but steadily, a heat built from carefully tended embers rather than flame. The baker wiped his brow with the edge of his sleeve, his forearm leaving a pale streak in the layer of flour that dusted his tunic. A second batch of dough now rose in wide wooden bowls tucked along the inner wall, the surface scored with faint lines to test its readiness. The apprentices had grown quieter as the day lengthened, not from tiredness, but from the steady pull of repetition. The motions had become slower, more deliberate, a tempo adjusted not by the ticking of clocks, but by the rhythm of hands that had done this every day of their lives. At the far end of the room, a young woman, the baker's niece, stood, carefully slicing thin rings of onions and dried olives to mix into the afternoon loaves. The olives had been preserved in oil jars the previous winter, their saltiness mellowed by time. She worked methodically, pausing every few slices to place her hands near the heat of the oven, not too close, just near enough to warm her knuckles and soften the chill from the morning's dampness. Outside, the city shifted. In the marketplace nearby, fewer stalls had opened. The spice merchant's tent had not appeared in 2 days, and the cart that once carried lemons from the far gardens now sat under a canvas cloth, untouched. But there were still sounds, soft, consistent. The turning of millstones at the community granary, the rustling of dry palm fronds sweeping across the marble steps of the forum, the shuffling of sandals worn thin on uneven stone. Inside, the baker paused briefly to inspect a row of cooling loaves. He tapped one gently with his knuckle, listening for the hollow thump that meant the center had baked fully. Then he unwrapped a cloth bundle, a handful of black cumin seeds, dried and fragrant. He scattered them lightly over a third of the loaves, leaving the others plain. Not every palate welcomed the bitterness, but those who did were always grateful. Beside him, a younger boy, one of the orphan boys taken in during last year's early frost, had been assigned to shape toe into rolls for the gatekeepers. His hands were smaller, unsure, but precise. He lined the rolls on a wide bronze tray, spacing them evenly. One roll fell slightly out of place. He looked up, uncertain. The baker said nothing, only adjusted the boy's thumb slightly, then returned to his kneading. The tray was placed gently into the oven's side compartment, where the heat was lower and the crust would soften instead of crisp. By now, the scrolls had arrived from the palace kitchen, not orders, but acknowledgments. The Empress's household thanked the guild for their diligence and included a list of preferred breads for the next 7 days. The baker traced the wax seal idly with a forefinger, then passed the scroll to his wife, who stored it in the wooden chest beside the spice shelves in the corner. A shallow basin of cool water held the cleaning cloths. Each one was rinsed and wrung by hand, then laid to dry in the softest patch of sunlight near the door. Even this task was deliberate. Cleanliness was not for appearances, but for care. The bakery was sacred in its own way. It had fed saints and sailors, children and emperors alike. Later, a young guard arrived, quiet-voiced, shoulders damp with sweat from his walk along the inner wall. He brought news that a new watch had been posted at the Adrian-Opal gate, and that rations would need to be adjusted by morning. Kay left with a linen-wrapped parcel tucked under his arm, his thanks spoken low but clearly as the afternoon shadows lengthened. The bakery's pace slowed once more. The flour had nearly run out, and the last scoop was divided carefully between 2 bowls. A fresh sourdough starter, thick and musky with life, was set aside for tomorrow. It had been tended for years, fed, stirred, cared for like a sleeping animal. The baker touched the edge of the bowl gently before covering it. Nothing here was rushed. Nothing was wasted. Each movement served not only the city's needs, but its soul. If you had stood in that room, breathing in the warmth of the fire, feeling the powdery grit of flour beneath your fingers, hearing the hush of footsteps over stone, would you have felt to the soft certainty that this, above all else, was what would hold the city together? As dusk settled over the domes and rooftops of Constantinople, the final warmth of the bakery's hearth began to fade. Not with urgency, but with dignity, like the last glow of coals that have done their day's work faithfully. The bakery was quieter now, with only the soft scrape of a wooden bench across the floor and the muffled hiss of a damp cloth pressed gently against a stone counter. The day's bread had been shaped, cooled, and given. What remained were the tools, the dough bowls, the worn spatulas, the cloths used to wrap hot loaves, each cleaned with care and set aside as they had been for years. No one spoke of endings. There were only continuations. One loaf into another, one fire into the next, one day into evening. A lantern was lit near the door, its flame small and steady. It gave off the faint scent of tallow, earthy and familiar, casting a golden glow over the wall where old parchments hung. One bore the seal of a long-past emperor, a reward for feeding the poor during the harsh winter of his 3rd year. Another, older still, was a prayer written in a careful, faded hand. May those who bake be granted warm hands, steady hearts, and full baskets. The baker's wife arranged the remaining loaves on a low shelf, wrapping each one in rough spun cloth. These were for the night watchmen, the quiet men who would pace along the wall while others slept. She placed beside them a small bundle of sweet herbs tied with thread, not because it was needed, but because it was kind in the upper alcove. The baker sat for a moment with a simple meal, a heel of bread from yesterday, softened and warm, broth, and half of a fig preserved in honey. He ate slowly, chewing with attention. There was no rush. He did not eat because he was hungry, but because eating was part of honoring the day's labor. Outside the door, a gentle wind stirred the edges of the old market square. The stalls had closed, and the streets now carried only the sound of sandals on stone, the occasional whisper of prayer, and the distant clang of the final tower bell as it marked the coming dark. The birds had settled into silence, and even the cats had found warm places to curl into. One apprentice lingered at the oven's edge, peering into the ash with soft wonder. The glow inside was nearly gone, but it pulsed faintly, as though the day itself was sighing into stillness. The boy would be entrusted with lighting the first fire tomorrow, and he knew, as his master had taught him, that the first spark must come from the last ember. Never a new flame, as the last of the doors were latched and the final tools set gently in place. The scent of flour lingered in the air, dry and warm, touched with rosemary and wood smoke. It clung to their clothes, their skin, their breath. It would cling even in sleep. And so the night arrived, not with fanfare, but with a hush, a soft descent of shadows, the folding of aprons, and the turning of the key. The bakery, like the city, had survived another day, not in defiance, but in quiet care. In the weeks to come, the siege would tighten. Rations would be measured by weight and water by the cup. But long before those days arrived, the bakers had already begun their answer, not with resistance, not with armor, but with dough and fire and the silent promise of warmth. Would you have noticed it as you passed the flickering window, that quiet oath whispered in every loaf, that calm defiance of despair, rising slowly like bread in a resting bowl? Beneath the restless stone heart of Constantinople lay a world without sunlight, vast, cool, and whisper quiet. The basilica cistern, built in the days when emperors still rode chariots through columned streets, had become a place of refuge, not just for water, but for silence. You would have to descend stone steps worn smooth by the weight of centuries, pass under a low arch with damp mortar seams, and step into air thick with the scent of earth and ancient moss to reach it. Here, light moved slowly. A few oil lamps, mounted along the staircase and tucked into crevices in the great columns, offered a dim, golden glow that reflected in the still black water. Each flame flickered gently on the surface, doubling itself in soft ripples as if the cistern breathed in candlelight. The columns, hundreds of them, stood in silence, some fluted, others plain, a few crowned with old capitals repurposed from forgotten temples. They rose from the water like trees frozen mid-growth, their surfaces wet to the touch, beaded with a sheen that smelled faintly of clay and iron. The water carriers, men of no particular fame, dressed in wool tunics, darkened with use, moved carefully through this subterranean calm. They walked narrow wooden walkways built over the water's edge, guiding their steps by instinct more than sight. Their task was simple and old, to collect clean water for the upper districts, yet it was not a chore, rushed, or taken lightly. The city's reliance on them grew deeper as the outer wells dried. The fountains ran slower, and the siege crept closer like a tide under moonlight. They worked in pairs. One man dipped a long ladle made of copper into the cool surface, filling a jug that waited quietly on the platform. The second would lift the jug with a careful swing, bracing its rounded weight against his shoulder. They spoke little. Voices echoed oddly here, not sharply, but distantly, like memories spoken too long after. Its words, when needed, were whispered. The water tasted of stone and time, had rested in darkness, undisturbed, flowing from hidden aqueducts that stretched from the forests of Belgrade to the heart of the capital. No two vessels were ever exactly alike. Some were drawn from the edges, touched by sediment, and scented faintly of algae. Others were lifted from the center, clear and crisp, as if they had never touched air before. At one end of the cistern, a carved Medusa head lying on its side, her features worn smooth by centuries of moisture, stared up from the shadowed base of a column. The water carriers passed her without fear. She was simply there, as she always had been, guarding nothing, asking nothing. Curiosity for visitors, a landmark for those who worked below. The coolness was constant, a relief from the rising heat. Above, the city had begun to swell with the quiet signs of a siege. Stores drawn tight, windows shuttered, bells left unrung. But here, the temperature did not change. It held the same stillness at dawn as it did at dusk. Time passed, but it did not rush. The water, ever waiting, held its level, as it had through drought and flood. Through rebellion and coronation, each jug filled was lifted with reverence, not ceremony. The carriers tied wax-sealed cloths around the necks of the amphorae, then loaded them onto carts with woven straw cradles to prevent chipping. Some of the water would go to the kitchens in Blasini, some to the monks near Hagia Sophia, some to the soldiers on night patrol. None would be wasted. A boy, barely tall, enough to lift a full vessel, watched from a niche in the stone wall, eyes wide, feet bare. He had come to learn, not by instruction, but by watching. Case, one of the carriers, had told him only once, water must be carried like it remembers being a river. The boy did not yet understand, but he listened. This place beneath. The city was not silent, though it felt that way. It hummed gently, with dripping water, with shifting stones, with a slow creak of wood under weight. If you paused long enough, you could hear the breath of the city drawn through these walls. Not desperate, not afraid, just steady, enduring. And perhaps, if you had stood by one of those columns and closed your eyes, you might have heard the same faint murmur, a voice too soft to name that the water carriers listened for. Not a warning, not a promise, just a whisper of motion and stillness. By early afternoon, the rhythm of the cistern had reached its soft peak, not a frenzy, but a deepened steadiness. The air remained cool, heavy with the scent of stone and moisture. Water clung to the skin like a veil, never uncomfortable, simply present. A fine mist hovered over the surface in places, stirred only by movement. The soft drag of a robe, the careful lowering of a ladle, the quiet shift of sandals. On damp wood, the carriers worked in silence, but it was not an empty silence. It was full of old habit and shared understanding. Each man knew the weight of a full vessel, the slosh it made when sealed properly, the sound of a drop echoing down a distant passage. There was no need for instruction. Even the youngest among them had learned the gestures long ago. The way to steady a jug with a knee while knotting the lid. The way to test for leaks by the whisper of liquid against clay. 2 men, one with graying hair and a narrow scar that traced the edge of his jaw, the other, barely out of youth, worked side by side near the Medusa column. The older man dipped slowly, each movement measured, almost meditative. The younger copied him, not perfectly, but respectfully. Now and then, the older one would glance sideways, offer a slight adjustment, a hand raised without speaking, a nod toward a better grip, a tighter knot. No criticism passed between them, only the language of shared effort. In one shaded alcove, an amphora cracked during lifting. It had been reused many times, its base scored with old chips. A tease when it gave way. The water spilled silently into the wooden tray below, soaking the straw. No voice was raised. The jug was moved aside with calm hands. The water, not wasted, was offered to the cistern again, poured gently, reverently. One of the men murmured a line from an old saying, something about the generosity of things that returned. The carts above had begun their rounds, poled slowly through the sloped streets by mules wearing woven blankets soaked in rosemary water to keep flies at bay. The wheels turned quietly, the jugs cradled in bundles of rags and hay. Women waiting at convent doors received their share without ceremony. Soldiers at checkpoints nodded in thanks and passed the water to the shade. Apti, it was not enough to satisfy, but enough to sustain. Back below, a scribe descended the steps, carrying a wax tablet under one arm. He wore a tunic of clean linen, the folds marked by travel dust, and his sandals bore the pattern of mosaic tile from the palace. Perhaps he greeted the carriers, not with words, but with a respectful dip of the head. He had come to record quantities, something the guild required, a ledger of what was drawn and delivered. Even in times like these, he paused beside one of the main cistern columns, marked with a faint red X near its base, and dipped his fingers into the water. He touched it to his lips, not to taste, but to remember. Then he wrote a single line on his tablet, glanced upward at the slowly shifting light, and turned to leave. His steps were soft, fading into the damp echo. Elsewhere, a woman from the nearby textile district had come to offer a small pouch of herbs, dried mint, and crushed sage, wrapped in linen. It was not part of any transaction. She simply handed it to one of the carriers with a small smile. "For the jars," she whispered, "so they smell of gardens." He nodded, tucking the bundle into his satchel without unfolding it. The scent would steep into the clay, a quiet kindness carried along unseen by now. The boy who had watched from the niche had crept closer, crouching near the edge of the water. He had not been told to help, yet he fetched a coil of rope without being asked, handing it up with both hands. His uncle ruffled his hair softly, a brief gesture. It passed him an empty jug to clean with a swatch of linen and a bowl of lemon-rubbed sand. The boy worked carefully, knowing the clay was old and brittle. He worked not quickly, but properly in the far reaches of the cisterns. Beyond the familiar chambers, water dripped from unseen cracks. The sound was slow, irregular, a rhythm only the carriers could recognize. They said it changed with the seasons, and now, with the siege above, even the drips had quieted, as if the city's breath had deepened, gone inward, conserving what it could not, and so the men moved, one vessel at a time, never rushing, always steady. They were not soldiers. They carried no blades, yet without them, no pot would boil, no cloth would rinse, no lips would be wet. They were the stilled hands beneath the surface, the invisible pulse that kept the city upright. If you had walked those wooden planks, felt the cool air rise around your ankles, and watched the light shift across ancient pillars, would you have heard the story the water carried, not shouted, not sung, but whispered from jug to jug, from hand to hand? As evening descended over the city above, painting the sky in shades of pewter and rose, the cistern below remained unchanged. No dusk reached these depths. The same soft glow of oil lamps illuminated the stone columns. The same water lapped quietly at the foundations of the city's strength. Time here did not pass in minutes or hours, but in footsteps, in jugs filled and emptied, in the shifting echo of voices grown still. The carriers began their final rounds, not because the work was done, but because the night required rest, and rest was part of enduring. Each vessel was checked once more, its seal pressed firm, its sides wiped clean with a cloth dampened in sage water. The walkways, slick with the breath of stone, were tread one last time with care. No steps were wasted. Every movement remained as deliberate as the first. A young man lingered beside one of the central columns. His tunic clung damply to his arms, and his hands, reddened from hours of carrying clay, rested at his sides. He leaned forward, peering into the dark water at his feet. His reflection, faint and shivering with the candle's flicker, looked back without expression. Perhaps he thought of his family in the northern quarter, perhaps of the bread they would bake with this water, or the laundry his sister would rinse by morning. He said nothing. He simply stood for a long moment and breathed. In another corner, the older carrier, the one with the narrow scar, knelt beside the Medusa stone. He touched the base of the pillar lightly with his fingers, not as ritual, but from habit. He had done this every evening for 30 years. Just a moment of contact, of grounding. The column was always cool, always damp, always present. A constant when the world above shifted like sand. The boy, too small to carry water, but not too small to watch, sat cross-legged on the lowest stair, staring into the stillness. His uncle handed him a folded cloth and said softly, "Guard this." The boy clutched it to his chest, not understanding the full meaning, but sensing the weight of trust. Tomorrow, he would be given a smaller jug, a practice run, a beginning. The final cart was loaded above. The wheels turned slowly, guided by lantern light, the mule's hooves padded with straw. It would pass through the quiet streets, past shuttered shops and sleeping fig trees, past guards whose voices had grown softer as the nights grew longer. At each stop, water would be left with care, not abundance, but enough. Back inside the cistern, the lamps were extinguished one by one, each flame snuffed with a damp cloth, leaving behind a faint scent of smoke and cooled oil. The last carrier to leave placed a hand on the stone wall near the entrance, the spot worn smooth by thousands of fingers. He closed the door gently behind him. The sound echoed faintly, then faded, and in the deep silence that followed, the basilica cistern returned to stillness. The water, undisturbed, reflected the now dark ceiling. The columns stood like silent sentinels. The Medusa had watched, as she always had, through centuries of empire, of flood, of war and peace. Nothing here moved without purpose. Nothing was forgotten. The city above would face many nights, many trials, but beneath it, this place, cool, hidden, unchanging, would continue to breathe. With every drop drawn, every jug lifted, every whisper passed between stone and water, the carriers upheld something far older than the siege, carried not only water, but memory. They moved in rhythm with a city that refused to break. Would you have noticed, standing there in the hush, how the stillness itself felt alive? How every ripple carried not fear, but quiet resilience. In a narrow lane behind the Forum of Theodosius, far from the great gates and echoing bells, sat a quiet house of faded sandstone. Its windows small and square, its door arched but unadorned. Behind that door, in a room lit only by filtered sunlight and the flicker of an oil lamp, a weaver began her day. Her loom, made of smooth olive wood, creaked softly as she adjusted the shuttle threads. It stood near the window, where a breeze sometimes passed through, carrying with it the scent of dust, iron, and on clear days a faint sweetness from crushed laurel leaves sold in the marketplace. The weaver did not pause to listen for the sounds of distant alarm or rumor. Smooth, as she always had, with unhurried hands and a rhythm that had not changed in years, she wore a simple tunic, belted at the waist, the hem faded from washing, and the sleeves rolled back. Her hands bore the gentle calluses of decades of work. The pads of her thumbs thickened from thread to tension, her fingertips smooth where fibers had passed across them again and again. On the shelf beside her loom, dyed yarns lay in small, woven baskets, each coil arranged not by color, but by season. The winter wools were thick and deep-hued, ox blood, forest ash, muted gold. The spring threads, which she now drew from, were thinner, slighter, pale lapis, dust rose, and the soft off-white of raw flax. The siege did not yet show itself here in full. There were fewer voices in the street, yes, and fewer deliveries of salt and wine. But her yarn still came slowly, and not always the shade she ordered, yet it came. The dyed master's boy had brought 3 skeins the day before, wrapped in wax cloth and carried in a reed basket. He'd said nothing, only nodded and handed her the bundle. The soles of his shoes already turned to go. The weaver stretched the warp threads tightly across the frame, adjusting the tension with the heel of her palm. The process was quiet, but not silent. The loom hummed faintly with each motion, the wooden rods knocking softly into place, the shuttle clicking back and forth in calm regularity. She worked by instinct, her hands remembering patterns her mind had long ceased to name. Outside, the world drifted. The usual creak of carts was gone. A cat sat sunning itself on a rooftop, tail flicking at a fly that refused to land. Distantly, a bell rang, not from the church, but from a watchtower. 3 short chimes, a signal, perhaps, to someone stationed on the third wall, but it passed without comment. The weaver did not stop. She wove a border first, a quiet line of alternating knots, a pattern her grandmother had taught her in a courtyard shaded with fig trees. It was neither intricate nor bold, but balanced, strong, meant to hold the fabric's shape when the middle threads loosened with use. She hummed faintly, a breath more than a tune, as she passed the shuttle left to right, right to left. On the far wall, a clay cup of water rested beside a worn spoon. In it, she had steeped a few curls of dried lemon peel in a pinch of barley husk. The scent was gentle and dry, the flavor faintly sweet. She drank sparingly, not from fear of shortage, but from habit. She had always taken small sips when she worked. To drink too quickly was to lose the rhythm. The cloth she was making would be a table covering simple, for a widow who lived 2 streets down and whose sons had left with the last levy. The widow paid not in coin, but in dried lentils and a small jar of pickled garlic. The weaver accepted without discussion. Cloth was still needed. Even now, the light shifted slowly. The room grew warmer. Motes, danced in the golden beam that filtered through the window slats. The weaver did not look up. Her fingers moved like tidewater, steady and soft, pressing the weft with each pass, tightening the edges with small, practiced motions. By the door, a folded note had been slipped beneath the threshold. She had not read it yet. Seer wind. The thread reached the halfway mark. That had always been her rule. Work first, then read. Not because she feared the message, but because even news should wait its turn behind the loom. If you had entered, then stepped gently across the stone threshold and sat in the corner without speaking, you would have seen a woman at work, not in defiance, but in continuity, weaving, not with urgency, but with care. And you might have wondered, as her hands moved over the quiet loom, whether it was the cloth she shaped or the time itself she was quietly holding together. The cloth grew inch by inch as the afternoon wore on. It was slow work, not because she hesitated, but because speed had never been part of her method. The weaver believed in the weight of each motion, in the necessity of attention. She once told her apprentice, long ago, the thread does not know the hour, only the hand. And so her hands remained steady, while outside the world stirred. In quiet uncertainty, each pass of the shuttle laid new meaning into the fabric. Pale blue lines formed a lattice, thin as reed stalks in a marsh. Between them, she wove soft ecru bands, left undyed, their texture offering contrast instead of color. She leaned forward now and then to check her spacing, breathing through her nose in the still dust's wheat air. The oil lamp crackled softly, its wick trimmed just after midday, now low and steady. Like a thought held too long. From beyond the door came the distant clatter of pottery, someone washing up at a neighbor's stoop. No voices, just the sound of cups touched gently against stone. Perhaps the widow who had commissioned the cloth, or perhaps someone else following their own quiet ritual. The city had grown cautious with its volume, as though every sound might invite a response from beyond the walls. The weaver paused at last, reaching for the folded note left earlier. The parchment was thin and creased, folded without seal or flourish, bore only a few lines. A request from the district warden for any spare woven goods, sashes, belts, linen strips for binding splints and bandages. No demand, no signature, just a neat. She set it beside her thread basket and resumed her weaving. There would be enough. Her fingers shifted from the tablecloth's body to a side panel, a border stitched in a geometric wave pattern. It was a design from her childhood village, now long abandoned after the river changed course. No one else in the quarter wove it anymore. It's a shape, once bright in reds and rusts, now emerged in quiet tans and faded lavender, made from remnants of older yarn. It did not need to match. It only needed to hold. Outside, the sun had begun its descent. Shadows lengthened across the narrow lane, and light filtered into the weaving room in long amber shafts, softening the corners and turning the dust to gold. The breeze brought the faint scent of something charred, not fire, but overcooked. Grain, perhaps, from a nearby pot left too long. It passed quickly, replaced by the more familiar smell of flax and old wood. She reached for a thread hook, its wooden handle worn smooth. With it, she adjusted a skip stitch, pulling it back gently into place. The tool had belonged to her mother, and her mother before that. Its grain held the memory of hundreds of cloths, of baby wraps, festival banners, burial linens, and sacks for storing barley. It was not a tool for war, but for living. The weaver shifted her weight, adjusting the small cushion beneath her. She did not suffer in stillness. Her body had adapted to the hours, the angles, the needs of the frame. She drank a final sip of lemon barley water, then returned the cup to the sill beside a small sprig of rosemary drying on a tile. She would use it later, perhaps to flavor broth, or to boil into a rinse for cleaning the linens. A pigeon fluttered onto the roof above, its claws scraping against tile. Then quiet. The birds still came, even now. They had always known how to survive cities in trouble. She once believed they were messengers sent by saints, but now she saw them as something simpler, patient creatures with hollow bones, content to wait on rooftops for the world to settle. The cloth neared its final third. She would finish it by dusk if the lamp held, not because it was due, but because some things are best completed within the rhythm they began. If left overnight, the yarn might stretch differently in the damp. The tension would shift. The song of the loom would be lost. She hummed again, a low sound that vibrated softly in the chest, not loud enough to carry beyond the walls. It was a melody she did not remember learning, one that came when her hands were too deep in work to think of anything else. It had no beginning and no end, and as the weft tightened into place and the pattern drew near its close, she thought not of what might come tomorrow or the next, but only of the next line, the next pass, the feel of the wood against her fingers, the soft whisper of thread through frame. Would you have felt it? Had you stood just inside the doorway? The quiet strength, not of defense, but of devotion. It's that quiet patience that holds a city together, thread by thread. By the time the last row of thread was woven into the cloth, the room had grown dim. Only the soft glow of the oil lamp now lit the weaver's hands as they moved with care, guiding the final weft into its resting place. She leaned back slowly, placing the shuttle down with a faint thump upon the worn tabletop. Her breath, which had been quiet and steady throughout the afternoon, steepened just slightly, the gentle exhale of something completed. She did not clap or sigh or speak. She simply sat in stillness, watching the pattern she had shaped stretched calmly across the frame. The fabric was not elaborate, no grand motifs, no flourishes, but it was balanced, whole, quietly dignified. It's the kind of cloth made not for show, but for presence. The kind that lives on tables, where hands gather, where cups are passed, where silence sits comfortably between sips. The weaver reached for a pair of small bronze shears. Their blades dulled slightly with age. With 3 quiet snips, she freed the finished cloth from its tether. The tension released with a soft sigh, the threads settling into their final form as if exhaling after a long breath. She folded it once, then again, pressing it flat with the palm of her hand. It was still warm from her touch. Beside her, the note requesting bandages remained. She opened a wooden drawer, pulling from it a few older linens and an unused sash. These she set beside the tablecloth, wrapping them into a neat bundle and tying them with a strand of undyed thread. She would deliver them herself on the way to the well at first light. The oil in the lamp flickered low, the wick now half burned. She trimmed it with a quiet motion, extinguishing the flame between her fingers with a practiced pinch. The room fell into soft shadow, the window's final light casting long amber lines across the floor. The loom stood empty now, its frame like a doorway awaiting its next purpose. She tidied her space slowly. The spindle of unused thread was returned to its basket. The cushion beneath her knees was shaken out and leaned against the wall. A bowl of lavender water was poured into the small basin near the hearth for soaking her hands, not because they were dirty, but because they ached, and the warmth would help. She dipped them in slowly, flexing each finger beneath the surface, letting the scent rise gently through the still room. Outside, the wind shifted. Leaves rustled against the wall. A faint bell rang from the inner district, one note only, long and low, its meaning unclear. The weaver paused to listen, not with concern, but with curiosity. Then she arose, took a linen shawl from a peg near the door, and stepped into the courtyard there. The light of the evening was pale and delicate. The sky had faded into shades of parchment and soot. A dove landed on the rim of the old basin where rainwater collected. She watched it drink, the ripples spreading softly across the surface in the stillness. The weaver stretched her arms, shoulders relaxed from their long posture. She closed her eyes for a moment, her face, worn but peaceful, tilted slightly upward, as if tasting the air, a mixture of stone dust, faint smoke, and the last breath of time from a cracked pot near the steps. Later, she would eat a simple meal, lentils cooked with garlic, a few olives, a piece of yesterday's bread softened in warm broth. She would sit on the low bench near the hearth, wrap her shawl around her shoulders, and listen to the soft click of the clay wind chime that hung outside her window. She would not speak. There would be no visitors tonight. But the silence would not be empty. It would be filled with thread and rhythm and the quiet satisfaction of something made whole. And tomorrow she would begin again. Would you have seen it in her, had you passed by her door? Not resistance, not fear, but something more ancient and enduring, the slow, patient weaving of life, even as the world held its breath. Tucked into a quiet fold of Constantinople's northwestern quarter, near the WWII Palace, where the city's edges met the sloping hills that overlooked the Golden Horn, there stood a modest workshop, shaded by the overhang of a fig tree. From the outside, the building offered no signs of its purpose. Its stone walls bore soot-darkened corners, and its roof was uneven, patched with tiles of slightly different colors. But for those who lived nearby, the scent that drifted from its open windows made its purpose unmistakable. Beeswax and tallow, resin and bay leaf, swarmed together in soft harmony. Here lived the last candlemaker of WWII. He was a man of quiet habits and measured steps. His tunic was often stiff with wax dust, and his fingers bore fine yellow stains that would not wash out, no matter how long he soaked them in lavender water. He had once trained 3 apprentices, but 2 had left for other work when the siege. Whispers grew louder, and the 3rd had been called to serve on the wall. Now he worked alone. The morning began as it always had. He prepared the wax with the same care he had learned from his mother, who had stood in this same workshop. Her sleeves rolled, her voice low and steady as she stirred a copper pot over the same hearth. He lit the fire with dried olive twigs, placing them in careful layers beneath the pot. The smoke rose quickly, fragrant and sweet, curling toward the rafters where dried thyme bundles hung untouched. The wax began to soften, shifting from opaque firmness into golden translucence. He stirred slowly with a flat paddle carved from chestnut wood, its edge worn smooth from years of contact. The scent of melting beeswax, warm, earthy, slightly honeyed, filled the air, mixing with the faint tang of old clay and sun-baked stone. Outside the door, a pair of sparrows fluttered across the dusty road, their wings tapping lightly against a hanging clay bell that no longer rang. The palace gardens beyond were quiet, their fountains stilled, the marble basins dry. Yet the candlemaker did not rush. There was no need. His task was not to prepare for the end, but to preserve light for the in-between, for the spaces before dawn, for the hours just after sunset, when the city's pulse slowed and shadows softened across its worn corridors. He cut the wicks by hand, tearing each length against the crook of his arm. The fibers were twisted linen, soaked briefly in salt water and left to dry beneath the sill. He tied them to a wide wooden rack shaped like a narrow ladder, suspended above the vat by iron hooks blackened from age. With practiced motion, he lowered the first row of wicks into the wax, pausing just long enough before lifting them again, letting them cool briefly in the open air before dipping once more. Dip after dip, layer after layer, the candles began to take shape, not all at once, but gradually, each pass adding weight, thickness, and form. The room filled with the soft rhythm of dripping wax, the hiss of wood settling in the hearth, and the occasional clink of pottery as he adjusted the ladles and bowls on his workbench. He worked by feel more than sight. The light that entered the room was muted, filtered through a curtain of woven reed. The shadows danced across the wall in tandem with the fire, moving like slow waves along the stone. Beside the window, a small ledger lay open. In it, the names of those who would receive candles this week: the infirmary near the monastery, the steward's hall, the chapel above the cistern, and 3 private homes, all with old doors and older hands that would be grateful for light. Some candles would burn beside icons, tays; others would warm calloused fingers as prayers were whispered. A few would flicker beside cups of broth, casting golden halos on clay walls. None would last long, but each was made with the care of permanence. And if you had stood in that room with the scent of wax and ash rising gently around you, the flicker of the hearthlight dancing across bowls of amber gold, would you have sensed it too? That quiet devotion to light, not as brilliance, but as presence. By mid-afternoon, the candlemaker's fingers had settled into their most familiar rhythm: dip, lift, pause, rotate. The wax, now clearer and thinner in the heat of the day, clung smoothly to the wicks in soft layers, each one building upon the last like the pages of an unwritten story. He worked in silence, save for the creak of the wooden rack, the occasional bubbling of resin along the edges of the copper pot, and the low murmur of the wind threading its way through the fig tree's wide leaves just beyond the window. The candles, now halfway formed, hung in neat rows, their bodies tapering in slow elegance, each one unique in its imperfections. Some curved slightly to one side. Others bore tiny drips where the wax had cooled too quickly. He did not correct them. A candle need not be symmetrical to offer its light. He paused only once to wipe his brow with a folded cloth soaked earlier in rosewater, and took a slow sip from a clay cup filled with barley broth. It had cooled since morning, but he drank it without complaint. Nearby, a small loaf of flatbread lay wrapped in cloth, half-eaten. His appetite had lessened in recent weeks, not from fear or age, but from the fullness of his work. From the back room came the scent of lavender. It was not fresh, but dried, crushed into small bundles, wrapped with twine and stored in earthen jars. He used it to scent the altar candles requested by the old nun in the convent at the edge of the district. She had sent a note 2 days ago, written in small, square letters, requesting 6 candles for the coming fast. "We will pray longer. This year," she had written. "Light helps us stay awake." He prepared a separate batch for her, smaller, shorter tapers with thicker wicks. These would burn faster, more brightly, illuminating the stone floor of the chapel where the sisters sat in silent rows after dusk. He mixed the lavender with a pinch of ground sage, stirred it gently into a separate vat of wax, and whispered something soft under his breath. Not a prayer, just a habit. Outside, a young boy passed along the lane with a basket of lentils, stopping only long enough to wave through the open door. The candlemaker raised his hand in return, his smile barely visible behind the shifting shadows of the workshop. He recognized the boy as the messenger from the small garrison that overlooked the northern harbor. They had ordered 10 candles last week, not for light, but for signaling, different flame sizes to be placed in different windows, should the need arise. Kurt, the candlemaker, had prepared them without question. As he resumed his work, he dipped the lavender tapers once more, then set the rack near the open window, allowing the breeze to cool the surface before the final coat. A few bees, drawn by the scent of honeyed wax, hovered outside, but did not enter. They seemed to know, somehow, that this place was not theirs. From a hook near the wall, he retrieved a small bundle of linen scraps, wick trimmings, old threads, melted remnants of failed candles. He bade them into the low fire beneath the pot, watching them disappear into soft flame. Nothing was wasted. Even the failed shapes gave warmth. Later, he prepared a delivery box lined with straw and strips of wool cloth and began arranging the cooled candles with careful hands. He placed them in rows, securing them with twine, leaving a small beeswax seal beside each bundle. He would not deliver them himself. The boy would return before sunset and carry them in his cart to the convent and the infirmary. In the stillness of the workshop, the candlemaker paused once more. He looked around at the rows of drying tapers, the cooling pots, the thin trails of smoke curling upward. Everything was quiet. Everything was ready. He moved to the corner shelf where a single candle stood, thick, twisted, its base cracked slightly. It had been his mother's, the first she had taught him to make alone. He had never lit it. Not out of sentiment, but because it had never been needed. He touched it gently, tracing the rough edge with his thumb, then returned to the bench. Sun now slanted low across the room, casting the candle forms into long golden silhouettes against the walls. The scent of lavender was stronger now, mingling with smoke, warm wax, the faintest trace of rosemary from the firewood. And if you had entered then, just as the boy returned to collect the box, as the light filtered through the reed curtain and fell upon the quiet rows of waxen forms, would you have seen the peace in the work? The unspoken understanding that even in siege, even in waiting, the world needed gentle light. Evening settled slowly over the quarter. The fig tree outside cast longer shadows across the lintel in the breeze that slipped through the narrow windows had cooled, carrying with it the muted sense of hearth smoke, turned soil, and something faintly metallic from the western wind off the water. Beside the workshop, the last of the candles had cooled. The boy returned just as the sun dipped. Lo, his small wooden cart creaking gently over the stones. He didn't knock. There was no need. He stepped through the open door, eyes scanning the rows of wrapped bundles now stacked beside the bench. The candlemaker nodded once, motioned toward the sealed parcels, and handed the boy a folded cloth with a scribbled list of destinations. They exchanged no words. The work was its own language now, as the boy wheeled the cart away, its soft clatter fading into the evening hum of the city. The candlemaker leaned against the doorway and looked out toward the fading light. The sky had turned to the color of cooling embers, deep orange pressed into slate gray. The rooftops of Blachany were still, with only the faint sound of a dog barking far off. Somewhere near the aqueduct, he stepped back inside and began his quiet ritual of closing, not in haste, but in practiced stillness. The copper pots were left to cool upon their stones, the remaining wax covered with cloth. The long wick rack was wiped gently with a length of oiled flax, and the floor was swept, each curl of wax shavings gathered into a clay bowl to be melted. Again, in days to come, at the center of the room, the candles hung like pale fruit on a tree, some short, some tall, all slightly imperfect, all enough. He took one, not the finest, but one that had set just right, and placed it in a brass holder carved with a faint outline of ivy leaves. This holder sat near his hearth, beside a small wooden icon of Saint Blaise, the patron of those who healed with hands and heat. He lit the candle with a long match pulled from a jar of ash and beeswax, watching the flame catch slowly, then bloom into its steady, golden glow. The flame danced gently, slight, falling across the walls, illuminating every dent and crease in the stone, every smooth patch on the old workbench, every curve in the empty mold. He would fill again tomorrow. The shadows that stretched behind the flicker were soft-edged, was a kind that moved like breath, never abrupt, never sharp. He sat, folding his hands in his lap. He did not speak, nor close his eyes. He simply sat in the glow of his own work, the candlelight washing over him like memory. The air in the room felt warmer, not from the fire, but from the scent of lavender still lingering in the wax, the rosemary that smoldered beneath the coals, in the faint sweetness of resin clinging to his sleeves in the distance. A single bell rang, not the great bell of alarm, but a chapel chime marking the turn to night prayers. One note only, drawn long into the air. The candlemaker tilted his head toward the sound, then looked again at the flame. That single candle would last until midnight, perhaps longer if the draft remained low and the wick trimmed carefully. It was not much, but it was enough to sit beside, enough to see by, enough to remember by. And when the flame grew small, when the wax drew in and the wick curled low, he would pinch it out with wetted fingers, not with ceremony, but with quiet respect. Then he would rest, for the night, for tomorrow, for the city that still breathed around him, quietly, in candlelight. Would you have felt it? Sitting there beside him in the wax-scented dark, the soft, steady belief that to light a single flame, again and again, was its own kind of hope.